A brand new padlock hung on the fire access gate, and it had the HOA logo on it. I stood there for a few seconds, dry wind scraping across my face like sandpaper. The dirt road behind my house had been there since 1994. On the original development map, it was clearly marked, emergency fire access only, not a walking trail, not a shortcut for kids on bikes. It was the only way a fire engine could reach the back of 37 homes, including mine. Now it was locked. A brand new sign had been bolted onto the black iron gate, community security measure, authorized by HOA. Security. I let out a short laugh, dry and hollow. In this part of the country, the dry season stretches on like a warning. The grass turns brittle yellow. Wind through the pine trees sounds like someone sharpening a blade. One cigarette tossed in the wrong place, and everything turns into hell within minutes. They called it security. I called it an invitation to disaster. My pickup was still idling behind me. I shut off the engine. No rush. There was no need to rush. People usually underestimate me. A 62-year-old man with gray hair, living quietly, not showing up to weekend barbecues, not arguing in the neighborhood Facebook group. To them, I was just a name on the list of homeowners who paid HOA dues on time. But there are things I understand better than they think. I have stood in the middle of a wildfire. I have watched flames swallow a roof in less than 5 minutes. I have heard a fire siren stall because a locked gate stood in the way. A 3-minute delay can turn a house into ash. 3 minutes. I walked closer to the lock. The metal was ice cold under my hand. No Knox box. No approved emergency override. Just a commercial-grade padlock, the kind you buy at a hardware store. The sharp click of high heels hit the concrete behind me. "What are you doing there?" I turned around. Karen Holden, HOA president. Navy blue blazer, hair pulled tight, clipboard in her hand like a badge of authority. I pointed at the gate. "This is a fire access road." She smiled, thin as paper. "We voted on it. This is a community security enhancement. There have been a few vehicle break-ins lately." I looked at her. "What about the fire trucks?" She tilted her head. "If there is an emergency, they can contact us." I did not answer right away. I let the silence stretch. I looked toward the tree line. I imagined an August night, strong wind, a spark jumping the fence, flames rising behind the row of houses. I imagined a fire engine stopping right in front of this gate. "Contact us. Fire does not wait for an email reply." Karen sighed. "You always think in the worst-case scenario. We are protecting everyone's property values." "Property values." I nodded slowly. "I see." She turned and walked away, heels tapping in steady rhythm on the pavement. In her eyes, I was just a stubborn old man clinging to the past, someone who did not understand the modern vision of gated community security. She did not know what I did before I retired. She did not know I had spent more than 30 years working with safety compliance standards, infrastructure maps, and state fire code regulations. She did not know I kept copies of the entire subdivision's original development records in my basement. I said nothing more. No arguing. No shouting in the street like those loud HOA stories you see online. This was not one of those Karen stories about fence paint colors or trash can height. This was about lives. And when it comes to public safety, I do not need to raise my voice. I just need to be right. That night, I went down to the basement. Dust floated in the yellow light. I opened the old metal cabinet and pulled out a thick folder, the pages yellowed with age. On the cover was the year 1994. I flipped through each page, lot layouts, technical notes, and then I saw it. Fire lane easement. Recorded. The county file number was still clearly listed. I sat down in the chair. My heart was steady. I was not angry. I just felt a cold certainty spreading through my chest. They thought this was a story about control. They thought I was just a difficult old man. They did not realize they had just locked something that did not belong to them. And there is one person in this county who truly hates anyone blocking a fire access road. The fire marshal. I laid the map flat on the table and smoothed out the creases. Outside, wind hissed through the window gap. carrying the scent of dry grass and pine sap. If they wanted to play a power game, I would play by the rules. The real rules. Fun high. The HOA email went out at 7 in the morning. By 7:15, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. The bold subject line read, "New security enhancement successfully installed." I read every line slowly, like I was reviewing an indictment. They called that locked gate a major step forward for the community. They said the measure would minimize the risk of outside intrusion. They emphasized the phrase community safety 3 times. Not a single word mentioned fire access. Not a single word mentioned the fire code. I took a sip of black coffee. Bitter, hot, real. My phone started vibrating. A message from Bill at the corner house, asking if I knew what was going on. Martha was worried about whether an ambulance could get in if someone had a heart attack. Another neighbor sent only one sentence. "Is that even legal?" I did not respond right away. I wanted to see how far they were willing to take this. That afternoon, Karen showed up in front of my house. This time there was no paper-thin smile, just confidence mixed with irritation. "We have heard that you are causing unnecessary concern." I leaned against the doorframe. "I only answer questions when people ask me directly." "You are implying that the gate violates regulations." I looked straight into her eyes. "I am not implying." She tightened her grip on the clipboard. The board voted unanimously. This was a democratic decision. I nodded. Democracy does not override state law. Her eyes flickered for a split second. Very brief, but I saw it. She was not entirely sure. "You are not an attorney." "No, I am not." I said nothing more. I let the silence stretch long enough for her to fill it with her own assumptions. To her, I was just an old man living alone, with too much time on his hands. A man who liked digging through old paperwork. She did not know I had spent more than 30 years sitting in county infrastructure review meetings. She did not know my signature had once sat beneath approved emergency access system drawings. She did not know I had worked directly with the Fire Marshal's office on hundreds of projects. I did not brag. I did not need to. Karen lowered her voice. "If you continue spreading misinformation, we will have to consider disciplinary action under the HOA bylaws." Disciplinary action. I gave her a faint smile. "I pay my dues on time. I do not violate landscaping rules. I do not paint my door the wrong color. Her bylaws do not contain a clause against asking lawful questions." She turned and walked away, her steps quicker than when she arrived. Some of that earlier confidence had faded. That evening, an emergency meeting was announced. Community meeting regarding security concerns. The clubhouse was packed. 30, maybe 40 people. Whispering filled the room like wind moving through dry timber. Karen stood at the front, beside 2 other board members. They ran through slides, talking about crime rates increasing 50% in nearby areas. They spoke about the responsibility to protect property. I sat in the back row, silent. Then a younger man stood up. "If my house catches fire in the back, how does the fire truck get in?" Karen answered quickly. "We will provide the lock code to emergency services when necessary." When necessary. I stood up. Not loud, not angry. "You are proposing that during a fire, the fire department must call the HOA to request a gate code." The entire room went still. Karen looked at me, lips pressed tight. "That is a temporary procedure." I nodded. "That procedure violates the state fire code. Emergency access routes may not be obstructed unless there is an officially approved unlocking mechanism." A woman whispered, "How does he even know this stuff?" Karen crossed her arms. "You are not a fire safety expert." I met her gaze. I never said what I was. I said only one sentence. "I have approved more than 200 projects with emergency access roads in this county." The air seemed to drain out of the room. A few people turned to look at me differently. Bill raised his eyebrows. Martha placed her hand on her chest. Karen blinked. "What field did you work in?" I answered briefly. "Infrastructure compliance. Retired." I did not add that I had served as a technical advisor to the Fire Marshal's office. I did not mention that I still had direct contact with them. There was no need. I sat back down. The room had shifted. The looks were no longer dismissive, no longer seeing me as a confused old man. Doubt had taken root. Not about me, about the gate. The meeting ended in thick tension. Karen left quickly, but I saw something new in her eyes. Worry. And inside me, a decision had fully formed. If they wanted to turn this into a power struggle, I would not argue any further. I would call the right person, and when that person showed up, that gate would no longer be just the HOA's problem. Funba. I once watched a house burn to the ground because of a locked gate, and I once heard a man scream as the fire engine was stopped outside. It was summer, many years ago. The hot wind blew like a furnace, pine sap dripping onto cracked, brittle soil. When the fire ignited behind the neighborhood, everything moved faster than the human brain could process. Fire does not travel, it charges. It leaps from one roof to another like a starving animal. The first fire engine arrived within minutes, but the access road was blocked by an iron gate, a rusted padlock. No one had the key. The man who kept it was away for the weekend. 3 minutes. Just a 3-minute delay. By the time the gate was cut open, the first house was already swallowed in flames. The second had begun to smoke. A man stood in his front yard, eyes red, hands trembling. He was not crying over property. He was crying because his dog was still inside. I stood there. I watched it happen. So when I saw that new gate, with its shiny padlock hanging beneath the words, "Community Security Measure," I did not just see a foolish decision. I saw an old script repeating itself. Many people in the neighborhood think I am overreacting. In their eyes, I am an old man living with ghosts of the past. Bill once told me quietly that maybe I should relax and enjoy retirement. Martha worries I am putting myself in trouble with the HOA. They do not understand. I am not afraid of trouble. I am afraid of complacency. That night I sat alone on my porch. Wind moved through the trees, carrying the dry scent of scorched grass. I looked at the dirt road behind the houses. It was quiet, modest, like a path no one paid attention to, but I knew its value. It was not a shortcut. It was a chance to survive. I thought back to my years working in infrastructure and technical compliance. Most people think that kind of job is paperwork, stamps, and procedures. They do not see late-night site inspections. They do not hear emergency calls at 12:41 in the morning. They do not read the after-action reports written when everything is already too late. Safety is not a feeling. It is structure, regulation, discipline. Karen and the HOA board see everything through the lens of property value. They talk about crime rates rising 50% in nearby areas. They speak about their duty to protect the community. I do not deny that concern, but security cannot eliminate an emergency exit. The next morning, I went back down to the basement. I opened the 1994 file again. The subdivision map had been drawn by hand, firm and deliberate lines. I ran my finger across the words, "Fire Lane Easement." It was not a side note. It was a recorded provision filed with the county office. I remember clearly the approval process for access roads like this. Developers had to guarantee minimum width. They had to ensure there were no permanent obstructions. Any modification required review by the fire marshal. An HOA can decide the color of a house, but it does not have the authority to erase a recorded easement. I printed another copy, folded it neatly, slid it into an envelope. That afternoon, I drove slowly past the locked gate. Sunlight reflected off the fresh black paint, glossy and confident. A small symbol of power, loud in its own way. Karen was standing nearby, talking with another board member. When she saw me, she stopped. Her eyes studied me, a hint of challenge in them. "You still have not given up?" I shook my head. "I have not even started." She let out a thin laugh. "You are making this more tense than it needs to be." "Not necessary." I looked at her, straight into the confidence that was beginning to show hairline cracks. She thought this was a battle between an HOA and a difficult resident. She believed power lived in a board vote. She did not understand that there are larger systems of authority, quieter but absolute. I did not argue further. I did not need to convince her. I walked back to my truck, opened the door, and sat in the driver's seat. In my hand was the envelope containing the map and the county file number. I looked at the gate one last time. If they had only installed a decorative fence, I might have ignored it. If they were arguing about shrub height, I would not have cared. But they had touched something that involved lives. And when it crosses that line, I am no longer just a retired old man. I am someone who understands the law, and I know exactly who to call. Funborn. I did not call the fire marshal right away. I called the county records office first. The clerk's voice on the other end was steady and professional. I read her the easement file number from the 1994 subdivision map. There were a few seconds of silence, just the sound of keys tapping on a keyboard. Then she said the record was still active. Fire access easement. No amendments. No termination on file. I closed my eyes for a second. Not out of surprise. Out of confirmation. They had locked a legally recorded emergency access route. I requested a certified electronic copy. She asked if I was the original developer. I told her no. I was a resident, and I had previously worked in county infrastructure compliance. Her tone shifted. More respectful. I understand, sir. When the confirmation email arrived, I printed 3 copies, white paper, black ink, a clear digital seal. No emotion, just fact. That evening, an envelope was placed in my mailbox. The HOA logo embossed on the front. I opened it right there in the kitchen. Notice of violation. They accused me of spreading misinformation and creating community unrest. They referenced potential administrative fines under the bylaws if I continued undermining confidence in the board. I read every line slowly. No anger. No surprise. Karen was doing what people with small authority often do when challenged. Attack image. Attack reputation. Isolate. Martha called me afterward. Her voice was worried. They sent you a notice, did they not? I heard you could be fined. I reassured her. I have not violated anything. But inside, one thing was clearer than ever. The HOA was not just confident. They were afraid. The next morning, I drove to the county office, a gray concrete building, old, unpolished. But inside those walls, law is enforced, not voted on. I did not walk in as an angry complainant. I walked in as someone who understood the process. I met an old colleague I had worked with years ago. He recognized me immediately. You have not changed, just more gray hair. I gave him a small smile. I handed him the easement copy, photos of the locked gate, and the HOA notice. He flipped through the documents, his brow tightening. They locked this road. I nodded. No permit. No approved emergency override mechanism. He exhaled. What do you want us to do? I did not demand anything. I simply said, I believe the fire marshal should be notified. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. I will forward the file. When I stepped out of the building, the sky was so clear it felt almost cruel. Not a single cloud. The dry season was far from over. That afternoon, Karen appeared at my door again, this time without a clipboard. Just a stack of papers in her hand. We have been informed that the county is reviewing this matter. You contacted them. I looked at her. I provided accurate information. You could have discussed this directly with the board first. I tilted my head. I did. At the meeting. You remember. Her eyes wavered. We did not expect this to escalate so far. I was silent for a few seconds. Then I spoke slowly, one word at a time. When you lock a recorded fire access easement, it is already far. She drew in a breath. You are putting the entire board at legal risk. I answered calmly. The board put itself at risk when it installed that gate. That was the moment I saw the shift clearly. In her eyes there was no longer dismissal, not quite regret either. It was recognition. I was not a cranky old man. I was someone who understood the system she had just stepped into. Rumors spread quickly through the neighborhood. Bill began standing with me. A few others emailed the HOA demanding to see the installation permit for the gate. The board's early confidence began to fracture, but I knew this was only the opening movement. Because once the fire marshal officially stepped in, this would no longer be a community debate. It would be a matter of compliance with state law. And the law does not negotiate. The county pickup truck showed up on Monday morning. No siren, no flashing lights, just a small emblem on the door, but the entire neighborhood went quiet. I was watering my plants when I saw them pull up in front of the glossy black gate. Two men stepped out, light gray uniform shirts, badges that read, Fire Marshal County. Karen appeared almost instantly. I do not know whether she had been notified in advance or just happened to be nearby, but I could see it clearly on her face. She was no longer in control of the situation. One of the men measured the width of the access road. The other crouched down to examine the lock. They did not say much. They wrote notes, took measurements, snapped photos. Karen approached them, her polite smile tight and strained. We are simply enhancing security for our residents. The older of the two looked at her, his expression completely neutral. Does this gate have a permit? The question was short, direct, cold. Karen hesitated for a beat. The board voted unanimously. I saw the other man's shoulder lift slightly, as if he had just heard an answer that did not address the question. I will ask again, do you have a building permit and approval for this locking mechanism? Silence. Wind moved through the trees. Bill stood in his yard with his arms crossed. Martha watched from behind her curtain. Karen's voice softened. We did not believe it was necessary, since this is HOA common property. The fire marshal wrote another line in his notebook. A recorded fire access easement filed with the county is not subject to cancellation by an HOA. No raised voice. No anger. Just fact spoken clearly. I did not step closer. I did not need to. I stood far enough away to hear, without interfering. Some people might think I called them out of revenge. I did not. I called because I have seen how this ends. Karen turned and looked at me. In her eyes was an unspoken question. What did you do? I simply held her gaze. I did nothing except provide documentation. One of the men walked back to the truck and returned with a folder. He read slowly. Notice of inspection and preliminary violation. Each word fell like stone. Obstruction of designated fire access. Unauthorized modification. Non-compliant locking mechanism. Karen swallowed. We can correct this immediately. The man shook his head slightly. You will receive formal notice. The compliance deadline will be stated clearly. If not corrected, fines will apply daily. Daily. I saw the board member standing behind Karen begin whispering to the others. One pulled out a phone. Another went pale. When the fire marshal officials drove away, the atmosphere in the neighborhood had completely shifted. This was no longer an email debate. No longer a tense meeting with slides about crime increasing 50%. Now it carried the county seal. Karen walked quickly toward me. Her voice was lowered, but there was a tremor in it. You could have spoken to us directly one more time. I looked straight at her. I did. At the meeting, I asked about the fire code. We did not know you had connections like that. I frowned slightly. Connections. I do not rely on connections. I rely on the law. She looked at me, as if seeing me clearly for the first time. Not a lonely old man, not a difficult resident, but someone who had worked within the very system she had just collided with. Bill stepped closer. So they really violated regulations. I nodded. If they do not fix it, the fines could accumulate very quickly. One of the board members cut in. How quickly is quickly? I did not want to cause panic. But I told the truth. Each day of non-compliance can trigger penalties under state regulation. If it drags on, the total could reach hundreds of thousands of dollars. Karen's breathing grew shallow. That would affect the reserve fund. The reserve fund. Residents' dues. The property values they had once cited. In that moment, I did not see enemies. I saw people who had grown too confident in their small authority. So confident that they forgot there are lines you do not cross. I turned away and walked slowly back toward my porch. The wind was still blowing. The dirt road still lay there, quiet. The fight was not over. But the balance had shifted, and this time, they knew I was not just someone who objected. I was someone who understood consequences. Fun Sao. The official notice arrived 3 days later, and the number inside it left the HOA board stunned. I did not need to read their internal emails to know what was happening. All I had to do was watch the way Karen stepped out of her house that afternoon. No neatly pressed blazer, no confident stride. She was holding a thick stack of papers, the edges crumpled in her grip. Bill was the first to tell me. "Have you heard? They were fined $10,000 up front, and $1,000 per day if it is not corrected." I nodded slowly. I knew that structure. Initial penalty and daily accrual. I had seen it applied to contractors who deliberately ignored code requirements. The difference was, this was not a large construction company. This was an HOA with a limited reserve fund. $1,000 per day was not just a number. It was a ticking heartbeat. That afternoon, an emergency meeting was called. Not at the clubhouse this time. At Karen's house. I was not invited. But news travels fast in dry wind. One board member who had opposed the gate from the beginning spoke up. He said we were warned. Another worried about liability insurance. What if residents sued for mismanagement of authority? Karen tried to stay composed. We just need to remove the lock and submit adjustment paperwork. But the issue was no longer just the lock. The fire marshal required proof that all structural changes had been approved before installation. No permit, no record. That was not just an oversight. It was a procedural violation. That evening, Karen knocked on my door. There was no threatening tone. No accusation of spreading misinformation. Only exhaustion. "We need to talk." I invited her in. My living room was simple. A few old framed photographs on the wall. One of them showed me in uniform back when I worked with the county. I noticed her eyes pause on it for more than a second. "How long did you work with the fire marshal's office?" I poured 2 glasses of water. I did not work inside that office. I was a county infrastructure advisor for more than 30 years. Every emergency access road in this area had to pass through my department before it was recorded. She was silent. "You could have made that clearer earlier." I looked straight at her. "You never asked." In that moment, the roles had fully reversed. The woman who once saw me as a troublesome old man was now sitting across from me, searching for a way out. "We did not intend to create danger," she said quietly. "We just wanted to prevent theft." I believed her, at least in part. The intention may not have been bad, but intention does not erase consequences. The fire code exists because of mistakes made in the past. I have seen those mistakes. I have read the reports written after disasters. I have signed recommendations for change so that no one else would lose a home because of a careless decision. Karen set the stack of papers on the table. If the fines continue to accumulate, the total could reach $250,000 within a few months. That number would not just drain the reserve fund. It could force every resident to pay a special assessment, and when that happens, they will look for someone to blame. She looked at me, pride and desperation mixed in her eyes. "Can you help us speak with the fire marshal?" I leaned back in my chair. This is the moment many people would savor power. Demand a public apology. Force a formal admission of fault in front of the entire neighborhood. I did not need that. I only needed the gate removed in proper compliance. I spoke slowly. "I can explain the corrective process, but I cannot erase the violation for you. You will have to take responsibility." She nodded, her shoulders heavy. When Karen left, I stood alone in the quiet living room. I did not feel victorious. I felt weight. Because this was never a story about ego. It was a story about the thin line between safety and disaster. And in the end, they finally understood what I had known from the beginning. The law is not there to be debated. The law is there to prevent the worst from happening. Fun by 30 days passed. The gate was still standing, and the fines kept rising. $1,000 a day. Accumulating. Cold. Emotionless. When the total passed $40,000, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted noticeably. No more theoretical debates about security. No more bored pride. Now there was fear. I saw it in Bill's eyes while he mowed his lawn. I heard it in Martha's voice when she asked whether we would have to pay a special assessment. I read it in an email chain leaked by a board member who could no longer handle the pressure. Karen tried to maintain the image of control. She sent out notices saying the HOA was working with legal counsel to review options. The phrase legal strategy appeared more often than community safety. But the law is not a strategy. The law is fact. One evening, a public meeting was held. The clubhouse was packed. The air felt heavy, like before a storm. Karen stood in front of everyone, her voice still clear but no longer sharp. "We are actively negotiating with the county." An older man stood up. "Negotiating what? A violation is a violation." Whispers spread. Another woman asked whether the board would bear personal responsibility if the reserve fund was drained. Karen glanced toward me, as if I were the center of it all. I sat still, hands folded. I did not need to speak. Then a younger board member, the one who had hesitated from the beginning, stood up. "I think we should remove the gate immediately and accept the mistake." The room fell silent. Karen turned to him. Removing the gate now could be interpreted as admitting legal liability. He responded, his voice trembling but firm. "We violated a fire access easement recorded in 1994. The liability already exists." In that moment, I saw the wall of authority Karen had built begin to crumble. Not because of me, because the truth had taken root in everyone's mind. A resident turned toward me. "How long did you work in this field?" I answered simply. "More than 30 years. And that was when the story fully turned. The people who once saw me as a troublemaker began to look at me as someone who understood the consequences. Not because I spoke the loudest, because I spoke the most accurately." Karen drew in a breath. "If we remove the gate and fully cooperate, will the fines stop?" I looked straight at her. "When compliance is restored and confirmed by the fire marshal, the fines will stop, but what has already accumulated will not disappear." By then, the total had surpassed $60,000. A sigh came from the back of the room. Someone whispered, $250,000 if this continues for a few more months. The room seemed to sway under that thought. Karen looked down at the papers in her hands. I saw her shoulders tremble slightly. No longer the confident woman declaring statistics about crime rising 50%. Now she was an HOA president realizing she had pushed her community to the edge of financial strain. I stood up. Not to criticize. Not to boast. I spoke slowly. "This is not about anyone's ego. This is about safety and responsibility. That gate must come down. As soon as possible." Silence. Then Bill nodded. Martha nodded, one by one. Karen closed her eyes for a second, as if accepting a personal defeat. Then she opened them and said, "We will vote right now to remove the gate." There was no proud unanimity like before, just hands rising in reluctant but necessary agreement. The motion passed. When the meeting ended, several people came to shake my hand. They thanked me. They apologized for doubting me. I simply nodded. I did not want to be the hero of an HOA story. I only wanted the fire access road open. But deep down, I knew this was not the end. Because the fines had already accumulated, and when the official bill arrived, that number would no longer be a warning. It would be reality. Funtam, the official invoice, arrived on a quiet morning, and it showed no mercy. The number printed in bold on the first page left the entire HOA board speechless. The total assessed fines had exceeded $120,000 and would continue to accrue until corrective action was completed and formally confirmed. No longer hypothetical. No longer a threat. It was reality. I knew about it before Karen knocked on my door. News travels fast. One board member accidentally sent a scanned copy of the invoice to the community email group instead of the internal list. Within minutes, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. Karen stood on my porch, holding the stack of papers as if it weighed more than it should. "We have signed a contract to remove the gate. The contractor will be here this week." I nodded. "But the fines continue until the fire marshal confirms full compliance." She looked at me, exhaustion and bitterness in her eyes. "You seem very calm." I answered quietly. "I have seen larger numbers. $4.3 million on an infrastructure project that was shut down over safety violations. When the law activates, it does not bargain. She said nothing. Perhaps for the first time, she understood that I was not speaking from emotion. I was speaking from experience. The contractor arrived on Wednesday. The shriek of metal cutting echoed through the morning air. Sparks flew bright under the sun. The glossy black gate that had once stood as a symbol of authority was dismantled piece by piece. Residents gathered to watch. No one spoke loudly. There was only the sound of steel hitting the ground and the wind moving across the dirt road that had been set free. I stood at a measured distance. No folded arms. No expression of victory. Just watching. When the lock fell, I heard the metal strike the pavement. Short. Sharp. Like a final period. Metal. But the story was not over. The fire marshal returned for inspection. They measured the width again, checked the road surface, required the installation of new reflective signage and a properly approved Knox box. Karen tried to steady her voice when she asked, "If we complete everything this week, is there any chance the fines could be reduced?" The inspector replied evenly, "We will report good faith cooperation, but the accumulated amount remains the responsibility of the HOA." Responsibility. That evening, another emergency meeting was held. The atmosphere was heavier than ever before. The reserve fund had been significantly impacted. There was a real possibility that each household would face a special assessment to cover the loss. A resident stood up, his voice shaking with anger. "We trusted the board, and now we are paying for a decision made without understanding." Karen no longer argued sharply. She spoke slowly. "I accept responsibility as president. We underestimated the seriousness of the issue." That moment was not the collapse of a powerful woman. It was an awakening. I stood. Not to criticize, but to clarify what mattered most. This is not about winning or losing. It is about remembering that some regulations exist because others have already paid the price with homes, with property, even with their lives. The room fell silent. Bill looked at me differently than he had weeks before. Martha nodded slowly. I did not talk about my past. I did not describe the nights I received calls at 12:41 in the morning because an access road was blocked. I did not recount the reports I signed after everything had burned to ash. I said only one sentence. Safety is not optional. 1 week later, the fire marshal issued a compliance confirmation. The fines stopped at just under $150,000, not $250,000, as in the worst-case scenario, but enough to leave a deep financial scar. The gate was gone. The dirt road lay open, bare but functional. That afternoon, I stood on my porch and watched the late sunlight stretch across the access path. No clanging metal, no polished announcement signs. Just a road ready for the worst, if it ever comes. And in that quiet, I understood something clearly. Sometimes real power does not belong to the one who casts the most votes. It belongs to the one who understands the line that must never be crossed. Funcine. 2. Karen submitted her resignation on Friday morning. No fanfare, no announcement, just a short email. I read it while sitting on my porch, early sunlight slanting through the trees. She wrote that for the good of the community, she would step down as HOA president after completing the transition. There were no long excuses, no blame directed at anyone. Only one sentence made me pause. We underestimated the seriousness of interfering with fire access. Underestimated. I lifted my eyes toward the dirt road behind my house. It was clean now, new reflective signs shining clearly in the sun. The Knox box was mounted in the proper location, at the correct height, fully compliant. Everything was finally correct. But the price had not been small. The meeting to elect a new president carried a different atmosphere. No polite laughter, no display of confidence. Residents asked more questions, requested more documentation, demanded expert consultation before decisions were made. Bill spoke to me before the meeting began. "You know, I used to think you were overreacting." I smiled. "Many people did." He shook his head. "I served in the Navy. I understand safety protocols, but I forgot how important they are when life has been calm for too long." That sentence stayed with me. Calm has a way of breeding complacency. When there is no smoke, we forget that fire can still ignite. The new president elected that night had opposed the gate from the beginning. He approached me after the meeting. "I want you to join the Community Infrastructure Advisory Committee." I shook my head gently. "I do not need a title." He looked at me seriously. "We need someone who understands the law." I was silent for a few seconds. Then I answered, "I will offer guidance when needed, but I do not want authority. I want responsibility placed where it belongs." He nodded. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. Not because of the fines, not because of the resignation, but because of awareness. Every new proposal was examined more carefully. Any structural change was questioned about permits. Whether it was installing streetlights or expanding parking areas, the first question was no longer about cost. It was about compliance. One afternoon, I saw Karen standing alone by the roadside, looking toward the fire access road. I walked over. She turned to me, her expression no longer sharp. "I thought I was protecting the community." I answered, "You truly believed that?" She sighed. "I never imagined a single gate could lead to nearly $150,000 in fines." I looked straight at the road. A gate did not create that number. The decision not to ask the right people did. She nodded slowly. "You know, when you stood up at that first meeting, I thought you were just a resident who liked making things difficult." I gave a small laugh. "I am used to being underestimated." She studied me for a moment longer. "I never asked what you did for a living." I did not listen enough. Not everyone is brave enough to admit that. We stood there in silence for a while. Wind moved across the dirt road, lifting a thin veil of dust. The road remained what it had always been, modest and unassuming. That evening, I sat alone on my porch. I thought about everything that had happened, about how a decision that seemed small could create such a powerful chain reaction, about how small authority, unchecked, can produce enormous consequences. I did not feel like I had won. I only felt lighter. Because one day, if a fire siren echoes through this neighborhood and something terrible happens, the trucks will not stop at a meaningless lock. And sometimes, what matters most is not who wins the argument. It is who is willing to take responsibility when everything could go up in flames. Fan Mui. 3 months later, a fire siren cut through the night. And this time, no gate stood in the way. I woke to the sound tearing through the air just before midnight. Not 12:41 in the morning like the calls from years ago, but late enough to make the heart pound harder than usual. I stepped out onto the porch. Far down the row of houses, red lights reflected against the black sky. Smoke was rising from behind a house near the woods. I stood there in silence. The fire engine sped forward, without slowing, without stopping. It turned straight onto the dirt road behind my house. Tires crushed over gravel, headlights sweeping across the trees. No lock. No call requesting a gate code. No deadly 3-minute delay. Only movement. Precise. Prepared. A few minutes later, I heard water surging through the hoses. The fire was contained quickly. No neighboring homes were touched. No one was injured. The next morning, Bill knocked on my door. He did not speak right away. He simply looked toward the fire access road, where the ground was still damp. If that gate had still been there last night. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Martha sent over a small apple pie with a handwritten note. "Thank you for not letting it go." I set the note down on the table and sat quietly for a while. In my mind, I saw the fire from years ago. The house swallowed in flames. The man screaming. The dog that never came out. This time was different. Not because of luck, but because of preparation. That evening, the new HOA president stopped by. He told me the fire crew had mentioned the rear access road as a key factor in their rapid response. He looked at me with respect and gratitude. "We almost ruined it." I shook my head. "You almost forgot why it existed." He asked me a question no one had asked before. "What made you so determined?" I looked out at the sky turning a deep shade of purple. I once worked in a system where mistakes were only recognized when it was too late. I have read reports no one wanted to read. I have taken midnight calls no one wanted to answer. I paused. And I did not want this neighborhood to become another report. He nodded slowly. In the weeks that followed, no one called me a difficult old man anymore. No one whispered that I had overreacted. But I did not become a symbol of anything either. I still mowed my lawn on Saturday mornings, still drank coffee on the porch, still lived the same way I always had. Only one thing had changed. Whenever I looked at the dirt road behind my house, I no longer saw a path that had once been locked. I saw a reminder. Real power is not in being able to vote to install a gate. It is in knowing when you must not. Many in the neighborhood learned that lesson through money. Nearly $150,000 is not a small number. But that price is still cheaper than a house reduced to ashes. Cheaper than a life. I do not regret calling the fire marshal. I do not regret being underestimated at the beginning. Because if I must choose between comfortable silence and necessary discomfort, I will always choose the latter. If you have ever lived in a community with an HOA, you understand the feeling. Small rules can grow into large power, and sometimes the person who stands up is not the loudest one. It is the one who has seen the consequences before. If this story reminds you of a time you had to defend what was right, even when others dismissed you, share it below. I would like to hear your story. If you believe safety should never be traded for image or ego, leave a message. And if you want to hear more stories where power is tested and truth holds its ground, follow Karen Karma Stories. Because our homes are not just property, they are responsibility. And there are some gates that should never be locked.